what I'm seeing outside through the window. It's a world of evil demon people, big hairy squatches, drug-addled yuppies, and complete asshats, locking arms and singing totalitarian praise as they... what? My TV? Oh my gosh, you're right. It is my TV. I thought it was my study window. Oh, phew! Danger averted. Stand down, my man. His name, Fons Status Structor, age 32 years old, a wunderkind of plastic surgery. He moved up quick and made himself a solo artiste in the perfection of flesh. He did it all with his own mysterious methods, and the results were deadly beauty. A location, Beverly Hills, California, USA. A date, January 2022, don't you know? Fons, not to be confused with the Fons, was a recent immigrant from Italy. As a young man, Mr. Structor quickly developed a set of skills to die for. He'd studied many things in higher education and finally focused on plastic surgery and enhancement. His focus was laser precise, his understanding and results fantastic. With the wash of praises behind him in Italy, he flew to Los Angeles and began a fresh career in a town that demanded his gifts. Lo! He did well indeedy doodles. Within a year, Fons was in practice in the heart of the elite, Beverly Hills. From there, it was effortless to gain and multiply a list of clientele. Women from near and far were knocking down Dr. Structor's door once his results were seen. And what results they were! Yet even better, he wasn't outrageously expensive, nor, even better than better, that his techniques were not invasive or painful, or requiring healing periods. It was a miracle for ugly women everywhere, or a godsend for surgery-obsessed women with too many mirrors and too little self-confidence. Fons found that his list of haplessly distressed dames grew larger as their years increased. Most just wanted their youth back, just a little if possible, to regain that perplexing hold of beauty over the opposite sex, or sometimes the same sex, or anyone that was oversexed. However, there was an endless waiting line of young, ambitious girls hoping to enhance their hand dealt by life's cruel hand in the game of DNA. They hated that the cards were stacked against them. They wanted 21 forever, and to always reap more than they could gamble. Fons was the man to do it. Somehow he was the one person that had more than ephemeral luck on his side. He'd welcome in clients, discuss their goals, nodding agreeably at anything they proposed. Then he'd ask for their preferred outlook, someone similar they'd love to emulate in their looks, as most surgeons do. Once agreed and a substantial down payment was cleared, the client would come back into the surgery for their treatment. The treatment, much to the shock and dismay of the noobs, was agreement to the terms, then laying back and getting a facial or body massage, depending on the area of treatment. And that was it. Yes, that was all. Dr. Structor would rub some light oil on his hands and their skin and have them prone before him in a small surgical bay, and then he'd massage his hands all over their targeted features, which, as you could imagine, was pretty exciting for both parties when it came down to breast implants. But enough of that. Some disgusting trollops even wanted their purses. Yes, XJ7, that is a technical term. massaged into a new and exciting shape. Those nasty beasts in that city. Yes, XJ7, there are flights at any time of day. So yes, that was the treatment. It would befuddle the women and the men who came for some real meat-slicing and bone-grinding surgery. They wanted to feel the improvements. They wanted to endure the pain that meant something had been accomplished. They wanted to cry in the arms of their friends or lovers and whine about all the horror of their experience. Instead, they could only describe a kind of light molestation from a professional and courteous and attractive young plastic surgeon. They'd leave in fear of losing their deposits to some quack hack, fly-by-night creep. They'd go home and down bottles of wine, telling their friends they believed they were just groped by a scam artist. They'd cry themselves to sleep and get their lawyers' numbers ready for speed dial the next day, when they had the fortitude to spill a confession of their stupidity and have some compensation returned to them. They'd awake to their flesh reshaping into their choice of form, and watch over days, marveling as they slowly morphed into the vixens they had all hoped to become. And the embarrassment vanished. Whoosh. Except for the men, of course. They didn't panic, and just accepted the results they knew would come. They knew they weren't stupid enough to get taken by a scam artist. Anyway, it would sometimes take days, maybe weeks, to achieve the end result, but usually, after the first night, the customers of Dr. Von Structor were quite happily advanced towards a stunning achievement of beauty and outward vitality. And ultimately, it was a mystery for everyone, but no one cared. It worked like an elevator, and that was what mattered. They didn't have to understand what was going on or fear plummeting to their demise, because it was obvious that science was wonderful and whatever engineering went into this medical marvel was too abstruse to understand. The world danced and sung around the enigmatic young doctor. Everything was almost perfect. Naturally, there were hitches in everything. Occasionally, there were people that wouldn't fulfill their obligations. It was harsh for the eager and young, hard-working medical professional, but if the client was indeed honestly unable to raise the funds, he'd let them slide. Plenty of people paid in full, and he wasn't wanting. Yet he was avaricious in heart, despite forgiving. Fons longed for the wealth and power he was reaping. Despite being rather easy with his defaulting few, he had no mercy for the unique and pointedly evil person he ran afoul of. A woman he had run his hands over, re-sculpting her into her full potential, and then her defaulting on the final payments, and summarily running to a lawyer and crying about molestation, botched procedures, and swiftly making a large media circus around his one-man practice. This harpy, named Devereaux, became a mightily stinging thorn in Dr. Structor's side. Time was eaten up by useless legal proceedings. Niggling scorn and ridicule came his way. People would occasionally vex him by bringing up her insidious high-profile slander campaign. In the end, when his rope had run out and Fons was out of patience and tolerance, he turned to his skills to settle that score. Late one night, clinic lights off, in the back room of Dr. Structor's office on Rodeo Drive, the man of so much success and stature descended to a depth no one knew. Yes, Dr. Structor was in his basement. A rare thing due to earthquakes and structural problems in that area. But anyway, Fons went down into his basement, where he ventured far along through areas only he ever trod. This was the inner sanctum, the holiest of his holies. where he carried out his true endeavors. This was where he would be surrounded by his supreme triumphs, his hall of beauties. There he was, walking amongst clay statues, life-size reproductions made by his hands, of all the people he worked on and made better by his touch. They surrounded him as a silent choir, frozen in youthful and optimistic gaze. Bodies, heads, hands, feet, the parts he needed to improve were ultra-realistically portrayed, the rest not so much. Most were clothed with heads in perfect semblance. Some, though, were completely naked, etc. The Structor looked lovingly at them, denying to pass a certain subject. He turns and slowly crafted her face a little more, diminishing the nose with a knife, reworking the jowls, smoothing the neck, and squaring the shoulders a little more. Once done, he came to another, a nude woman of meager years, which he added clay to her ample breasts, making her cleavage greater, slightly lifting her breasts and then filling out her lips, defining the cheeks and chin some more, removing slight belly fat, and so on. It was like a museum of trophies. Fons then moved on through the huge throng of silent attendees, set to witness his disgrace. He found Mrs. Devereux amongst the lot. She was fully formed face on a fairly unworked body of proper proportion. Dr. Structor brought up his hands, moving them across her face slowly, his nerves making him shake as he attempted to withhold the full fury he had within. The next day, Devereux and Structor met in court. It was a tedious and annoyingly prolonged meeting with lawyers and judge. Devereux wanted cash, lots of it, for damages. Structor prepared to countersue. No compromises were reached. However, Devereux's lawyer did notice that Mrs. D did have a slightly hangdog look to her face. She looked a little haggard. As days went on, bit by bit, as the devilish housewife and the daunted doctor went into court, the woman looked more and more worn in features. After the trial started, Mrs. Devereux had went from a vivaciously pretty middle-aged lady to something of a, dare I say, a drug-addled doorknob. She had extreme bags under her eyes and large and bulbous nose, thin lips, and a huge gobbler of an underhang on her neck, and jowls that would make Walter Matthau proud. Lines were everywhere a woman wouldn't want them to be. It didn't help Dr. Structor's case. In fact, his failure was on display for all to see. It seemed certain that he would lose his shirt on this case. Despite the treatment working at first, Mrs. Devereux was now a sad sack of skin and unseemly shapes, blurting out dismay and terror with every utterance. Yet the doctor was cool as a cucumber. He was reshaping her every night. With his arcane facility, he would take the blow on the chin and simultaneously display to the world what could happen if someone would cross him. Down in that curiously accursed cellar, Dr. Structor would wander while others slept, tuning his beloved clientele, then turn his attention to his bane, the beast, Mrs. Devereux. Turning her into a misshapen hag, she was a shrew inside and out, a fishwife. She deserved what she caused to come out of this man. A man simply hoping to succeed on the pleasure he could bring so many. The last night before trial's end, the vengeful doctor went below to deal his final blow. First, he took out fresh clay and formed himself a beautiful young woman he acquired that day, Eva Futura from Fontana. a pretty, youthful, hope-filled chippy, wanting to best her appearance here and there, to make it big and become someone with some respect and admirable physical traits to land and assure her safety and security in this cruel and disgusting world about her. Fons tenderly formed her from photographs he had taken, precisely measuring and reproducing the young woman, then using his memory, running his hands over her sculpture while incanting spells, using mystical oils he had utilized in the upstairs surgery. Massaging the female, he recounted her shapes, her feel, her structural specifics, while calling on higher powers to guide and benefit his endeavor. Until the statue of Eva was as lifelike and as exact as the real. Then a binding spell with blood he had removed for the pre-massage medical tests. Dr. Structor would inject the blood, tinged with certain extracts and tinctures, into the statue's heart. And a birthing of sorts took place, where a lump of clay was suddenly imbued with a kind of symbiotic essence of the original. And at that moment, clay and flesh were conjoined to become one. And the doctor could shape the clay and have it result on the flesh, many, many miles away. Structor was filled with admiration of himself, having twisted dark forces to his own needs in a wholly creative and beneficial way. He was clever and above the world in those moments of self-adoration. Soon he came down to earth once more. After improving Eva's minor faults, Fons moved on and sank to new lows as he approached Mrs. Devereux with deep malice once more in his heart. Hands shaking furiously, he moved his sculptor's knife over her face and neck. Fingers pushed into her eye sockets as he sweated profusely and laughed in maniacal release. Ha ha ha! Anyway, that following day, the stunned court sat hearing the testimony of Mrs. Devereux. She was an inconsolable mass of distorted humanoid form before a pale and disbelieving jury. The spectators whispered amongst themselves. The woman, whom was once fairly attractive, was now obviously in some kind of stage of existence close to death. Her eyes were sunken, huge bags under them, forehead bulging outward, cheeks shallow, jowls baggier than thought possible, a neck like a mega-turkey. Jury was sequestered. Only a couple hours had passed when a verdict was delivered, and that verdict shocked everyone in the court. Dr. Satis Fons Structor, not guilty! Mrs. Devereux's sobs and wails weren't heard due to a tightened gasp emanating from the gallery. She was overshadowed by lawyers, jawboning in pain and pleasure over the verdict. In the ensuing moments, the judge hammered for quiet and delivered justification. The jury saw that Mrs. Devereux indeed found her desired results, refused to pay, and had no justification for damages. Whatever happened since was a progressive act, clearly reliant on whatever lifestyle choices she pursued. Case closed! Most perturbed by far was the doctor. He couldn't believe what had happened. He was sure the jury would take sympathy on the sad and twisted woman deteriorating before them. It was then that he realized the world was indeed cruel and disgusting beyond contemplation. He was guilty. He was indeed guilty beyond any recourse. Yet he was to go free, unpunished, and get away with such indescribable evil as he had perpetrated. In that moment, the Fons felt the entirety of existence shift into something menacing and ominous, a feeling of innocence lost Without ceremony or companionship, he returned to his place of work and sat in his office, drinking from an expensive bottle of brandy, hoping to kill his mind and rekindle that world that existed before this day had started. Without much notice, the day had slipped away, and it was night. It was quickly deep night, and the world was quiet. Dr. Structor vanished below, into the basement stronghold, to be amongst his beautiful but immobile clientele. There, he drank more and contemplated what he would do to bring happiness to these around him, to atone for his wayward and malicious behavior. One by one, he went to the women he favored most, enhancing them more, ever slightly with extra care to make them extremely pretty. His gentle caresses continued through the early morning hours. Unknown to Dr. Structor, Mrs. Devereaux had spent the afternoon's dwindling minutes sobbing alone in a corner of her garage, once returned from the courthouse. Mrs. Devereaux tallied her life, her decisions, her friendships, regrets, wins and losses, and came up far below average. She was so far in the negative that she found only one solution. At 3:33 a.m. in the morning, Mrs. Devereaux, the now disformed and devastated woman, left this earth by face-planting herself into the earth from atop a tall building down on Sunset Boulevard. Behind Dr. Structor, completely unexpected, one of his sculptures began moving. It was wiggling around slightly, contorting a little, as if resuscitating from a drunken haze or mesmeric disorientation. It slowly stepped off its platform and looked at its hands. These were the hands of Mrs. Devereaux carved in clay. "Where am I?" It croaked out, an innocent yet savagely inhuman utterance. "Is this hell?" The statue looked around to all those surrounding her. The recreation of Mrs. Devereaux was now sentient and witnessing a sight she wasn't prepared for. This was clearly not something she had foreseen. "Who are you?" Faux Devereaux asked of another clay form. "Who are all of you?" Dr. Structor was shocked into his proper senses. Hours of whiskey and brandy and sadness left him when a pulse of terror overtook his brain. He heard the voice beyond him in the semi-darkness of the cellar. He saw some vague movements, and now believed he was compromised by some outsider infiltrating his lair. Grabbing the sharpest tool at his disposal, Dr. Structor moved furtively toward the disturbance. Within seconds, he came from behind it, into the light, and stabbed his knife into the person's back as it moved sluggishly into the shadows. The thought of murder was irrelevant to the professional sculptor. He was sure he could hide and dispose of any old fool that might have discovered his deepest secrets while down in that unforeseen cellar. Yet the knife sank in as if to putty. The figure swirled around quickly, recognizing the affront, and revealed itself to the besieged doctor as his nemesis, Mrs. Devereaux. In all honesty, he saw that twisted and ugly face recognize him, and realized it was her clay reconstruction that had gained life and mobility of its own. "You!" screamed the woman. "You did this to me!" He backed up, shrieking in terror at the sight. Somehow his spells and divine magic had bent fate. Structor hadn't thought of the devil's stratagem being linked to some sort of golem-like conjoining with another person's soul. Something was wrongly unanticipated, and it was now obvious that his work would need precautions. He should have severed the connections to the flesh after all work was done. Now, his finely sculpted patients could reverse their mortal course and take residence within these clay edifices all about him. The doctor knew what he had to do. Too late, though, I'm sad to say. Despite being a clever lad indeed, Dr. Structor's understanding of the universe he dabbled with was quite myopic and self-centered. As he had put the pieces together in his mind, he was met by a dissolution of sorts. Mrs. Devereaux's living statue grabbed the nearest, brightest object and flung it toward the unobservant man. It was an alcohol-filled globe with lit wick, used to heat utensils and light the general area of operation in that dungeon. There wasn't much to ignite when it cracked open on the ground, but what little there was quickly set fire to drapery and sheets about the floors and pedestals on which the various carvings stood. It wasn't more than minutes before the entire cavern was an inferno of burning paper, wood, cloth, and various incendiary items stored within. Clay was drooping, sagging, falling over, soon to be buried by metal as the ceiling collapsed inward from the intensity of the conflagration, and then a giant explosion from a propane tank. Dr. Structor made it out alive. He left it behind him as he ran, breathless, sluggishly trying to escape everything his life had now become. Everything was gone. Luckily, he was certain that Mrs. Devereaux was now gone as well, beneath the heap of collapsing building. She having no idea how to escape the labyrinthine cluster of clay clientele. A sun was rising on Los Angeles as he struggled up the streets of Beverly Hills to return to his home. Sirens were blaring. The Rodeo Drive area was the focus of every police and fire vehicle for a radius of 20 miles. He was only a few houses from his own when doors began opening and people emerged. There was a wailing from women everywhere around him. Coming out into the light of day, he could see all these women. Women he had treated, tortured beyond belief by the fact that their faces and bodies had transfigured and melted into inhuman and unrecognizable forms not unlike melted clay smashed under tons of rubble and steel. Like and subscribe before I die. And ring the little bell, or you will surely go to hell.
Oh, we're telling spooky stories. This is not a spooky story. Oh, there's no way I can say.
It depends how you look at it. It is kind of spooky.
I guess so.
Wait, that's it? That's the end of the story?
That is a